today we're going through scoping studies, and I think it's something that a few of the DPhil students are doing or have done recently. Sorry, Catherine, I don't seem to be able to click through them. I might need to ask you to click. So next slide. Next one. And so I'm going to give you just a very brief overview of scoping studies from an academic point of view, because I haven't done one yet. And then Naomi's going to give us an example and give you a bit more meat. And then Christiana and Yingxi and Catherine are going to give some experiences from having done them and sort of recap this academic view with making it a little bit more practical. Next slide. So what is a scoping study? So a scoping review or scoping study is really just another form of knowledge synthesis, and it's really well suited to exploratory research questions and can be used to either map key concepts or map the type of evidence that's available, but it's also quite useful for identifying gaps in the research in a specific topic, but doing this in a very systematic way in terms of the searching, selecting, and the synthesizing of the knowledge. Next. It's quite a new approach. The sort of 6 steps of how to do this were set out by Arksy and O'Malley in 2005, but it's quite a quickly growing field of expertise. So there was a study that was done to look at the scoping reviews that were done between 2012 and 2014, and nearly half of 1999 and 2014, and nearly half of them were done in the last 2 years of that time period. And 3/4 in that time period were done just on health topics. So it's quite an important methodology in terms of sort of public health and health. And the need for this method is increasing because evidence-based practice is becoming more and more important in making decisions, but the number of sources that you need to read to make those decisions has become massive, but also has quite a lot of variety, and sometimes it's not always possible to do a systematic review. Next. So what can you use a scoping study for? Well, the first is as a precursor to a systematic review. Next. And that's to determine whether a systematic review would actually be feasible or not, but also to see whether the studies are similar enough to be able to compare them and whether they would actually be relevant. But you can also use it to clarify the topic and then use it to define or refine your search strategy, your inclusion criteria, and your analysis criteria. But you can also use a scoping study as an end in itself. So it can be used to identify the gaps in the literature. So you summarize everything that's out there, and then you draw conclusions on what future research should be focusing on. It can also be used to summarize and present the data that's out there. So either mapping the key concepts or looking at what evidence is there, sort of mapping the range, the nature, the characteristics, sort of contextualizing what is known, and also clarifying some complex concepts. And interestingly, it's useful for 2 completely different and opposite uses. It's useful in emerging fields where there is very little evidence and you wouldn't be able to do a systematic review or other types of reviews. And it's also useful in really established fields where there's a lot of data and the data is very diverse. Next. The main question seems to be, should you do a systematic review or a scoping study? And that depends on a lot of things. Firstly, the research question for a systematic review is really quite well defined and narrow because it's looking to sort of provide a very definitive answer and synthesize that information to provide that answer. Whereas a scoping study sort of focuses on broader questions and is quite well suited to comparison. And then its purpose is that mapping, that illustrating, that contextualizing and clarifying. The systematic reviews focus on very sort of high quality papers and tend to focus on randomized controlled trials often, not always, but there's a very sort of explicit assessment of the quality and judgments made on weighting the different studies that are included. Whereas a scoping study doesn't do that and rather includes quite a range of different study designs. The process for a systematic review is all set out a priori, whereas scoping studies are more iterative, and you can, including the strategy for the search, the inclusion, the data extraction, and that can be refined as you go and sort of depending on what you find in the data. And then the systematic review, you'll sort of present at the end a synthesis of the information, whereas a scoping study can be either like an overview, it can be a map, it can be a descriptive account, or it can be something sort of more categorizing and more putting it all together. Next. But what you choose, because there are a lot of options, there's rapid reviews, sort of realist reviews, concept analysis, narrative reviews, there's a smorgasbord of options out there, but what you choose depends on what your research question is and what the evidence that you're going to be looking at is made up of. Next. So as with everything, there are strengths and limitations, and some of the really strong points of a scoping study is that it is more objective and comprehensive than, say, a narrative literature review, and it is well suited to answering much more broad questions than a systematic review. It's also very, very practical. It's flexible, it's iterative, and it allows the data to sort of guide the process, and to sort of, depending on what you find, you can refine your criteria and your strategy. It allows you to include literature with different methodology, and allows you to sort of combine qualitative and quantitative analysis approaches. And something that I'm quite drawn to is the fact that it really encourages stakeholder engagement and values the input that experts can have. But some of the limitations, just because it's not a systematic review doesn't mean that it's quick and easy. They tend to generate quite large volumes of data, which can be quite unmanageable, but also enforce that you have to make decisions about prioritizing the breadth versus the depth. It doesn't sort of formally evaluate the quality of the evidence, and it doesn't weight the studies, and it doesn't give a guide on how to synthesize the information the way a systematic review does. So you need quite skilled reviewers to develop the analytical frameworks to compare, contrast, and present the large number of studies. Next. So what's in a name? Is it a scoping review or is it a scoping study? And one survey that was done on methodology and terminology found that most people really did prefer the term scoping review, but scoping study was seen to be much more accurate in encompassing this analytical process and sort of separating it from everything that isn't a systematic review, which the term scoping review sometimes applies to. Next. So that scoping study seems to be more of a sort of appreciated term. Next. So how do you do a scoping study? Oxy and O'Malley came out with 6 steps in 2005 to try and guide the process, and these were added to with some nuance and some recommendations in 2010, and formal guidance was written up in 2015 with Prisma guidance for reporting that in 2018 that was just really a adaptation of the systematic review checklist. Next. So these 6 steps that Oxy and O'Malley put forward are identifying the research question, identifying the studies, selecting the studies, charting the data, collating, summarizing, analyzing, and reporting, and then consulting with stakeholders. Next. So identifying the research question and the purpose. What seems to come up often is that people say you should be very explicit about the purpose of the study at this early stage. You can have quite a broad research question, but you should try and define the scope by defining the concepts quite clearly and figure out what you're going to map the evidence in terms of. Is it in terms of the range, or is it in terms of something, a sort of an existing framework? You can also use the PCC mnemonic to define the key questions. So that's population, concept, and context instead of PICO, which I realized when I was trying to create a search strategy didn't really fit with what I was trying to do. Then you set up your search strategy and make sure that there's congruency all along that sequence of research question, objectives, search terms, and inclusion criteria. Next. Then you do your search, and you search widely, both in established literature and in the grey literature, and then you select your studies. So that can be quite an iterative process. You search, you refine your search strategy depending on what you're getting, and then you review your inclusion to see if you should include anything else. And it's recommended that a team approach is the ideal, and that if you can have a multidisciplinary team, it'll be a much stronger output, but also to make sure that that process of using multiple people is very transparent. And just a caveat is that this focus on breadth is likely to provide many irrelevant studies, which can be quite time consuming to make decisions on what to include and what not to. So don't do a scoping review as a sort of easy way out. Next. Then charting the data is like the data extraction of a systematic review, and what data you're extracting really depends on what question you're trying to answer. So you apply a sort of common analytical framework to all of the primary research papers, and you extract the same data from each one of them. But what that data that you're extracting is can be refined as you go, and you realize that there's something that is coming up that is quite important and that you should have extracted from all the papers. Next. Then you put it all together, and this is much more of an analytical step than just a descriptive process. Levac suggested dividing it up into 3 steps, which are quite useful. So the first is analysis, and that's you can either describe it sort of using quantitative methods, like the number of papers and the the range of the dates, that sort of thing. But you can also lean on qualitative analysis methods, which sort of adds a sort of different component. Then on reporting, it really depends on what the question is and how best to answer it. But you can report on the number and breadth and sort of map out what papers you found. You can report on the characteristics, you can categorize them, and then you need to report on the limitations of the evidence. And then the last part is to apply meaning. So sort of considering the meaning of the findings relative to your research question and to the context, but also the implications for future research. And what seems to come up again and again in reading about scoping studies is this pragmatic component and making sure that your results have sort of practical implications for policy or for practice. Next. And lastly, is to consult with the stakeholders, and that's to inform or validate your findings. This is an optional step, but it's being increasingly seen as essential and really is there to add methodological rigor. It can be a very formal process or it can be quite informal, but the point is to help sort of fill in gaps. So add sources that you may have missed, identify gaps in what you've done, but also to help you interpret what you've found by getting experts to give insights on the outputs and what it means, as well as understand how to apply it to the real world. So that's it from me and the sort of background overview. Now we can go into some more sort of meaty parts of an actual example.
Right. Thanks, Claire, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'll get right into it. I'll talk about our scoping review, what we did, just reflecting on the process and speaking mostly about the process rather than the results of the paper, although I will include that in the review. Allow me to keep my video off because of network. So next, please. Yes, so we did a review last year titled Designing Paper-Based Records to Improve the Quality of Nursing Documentation in Hospitals. And yes, it was a scoping review. So I'll get into it. Next, please. So like we've had already, the most important thing to do and to decide ahead is why are you doing the scoping review? You select your methodology, develop a protocol, of course, then do the review, use the findings, and then publish. So I'll take you through each of these step by step what we did and a bit of reflections on some of the things that we found along the way. So why did we choose to do a scoping review? Our aim was to understand how paper-based charts have been developed before. So this work was being done as part of a larger body of work that where we were planning to develop a monitoring chart for use in the newborn wards. But before going ahead to just develop the chart in maybe a method that we thought was relevant, we figured maybe we should understand how other paper-based charts have been developed, and especially those that have been used in inpatient settings. So there is the argument that, well, everybody is moving to electronic, but that's not necessarily true. And in many parts of the world, even in high-income countries, for inpatient settings, paper-based charts are still very important. So we wanted to understand those processes that have already been used, if there are any methods that were shown to work or were found to be relevant, then we would adopt or adapt those to our setting. And then we settled on the Axie and O'Malley framework that has been described, and reported our work using the Prisma scoping reviews, extension for scoping reviews checklist that allowed us to systematically document what we've done all along. The next thing was to decide for ourselves then what is our question. And our question is we had to state it out clearly so that then it guides the whole process. And our question was, what is the evidence on the development and implementation of newly designed or redesigned paper-based tools used by nursing staff? And we use this question as a starting point, and then put all these items that are listed here in a protocol. So the protocol allows you to plan your work ahead, and then you constantly refer to it, and you may have to modify it a little bit along the way as you go along, as you discover either new information or some things that you hadn't covered and you need to include in your protocol. At this point, I might mention that we in our project did not register this protocol as is common with systematic reviews, but we did get a comment from one of the reviewers to ask us whether we registered it. So maybe it will be something of something that we can discuss later. But if you do develop a protocol and you intend to register it somewhere, then these are the items that you would make sure you've covered. The next thing I'll go through is, so now part of developing that protocol is also something we call conceptualizing key terms. So what are these things that we're looking at? And we've had that we can use this mnemonic of PCC, that's population, context, and concept, which suits scoping reviews better rather than trying to use PICO. This also will help you define your search, write down your search strategy, and then also as you're developing it, it will come in handy. So let's see what we did. We had 4 key terms that we were looking at, and then out of those 4 key terms, we identified synonyms and how then would combine these key terms to develop our search strategy. The way we did this is I had to look at some publications that I thought would be relevant for the review. So even before you start doing your review, there are some articles that you might have identified that would be suitable for the body of work that you want to study. So those articles would be very important at this point. What are the key terms they have used, where they've been published, what does that look like? So that allows you to define your search strategy even better. The other thing you can use is just go to mesh terms and look at those terms and the definitions, and then pick words from there to help you develop your search strategy. And then, of course, your regular dictionary, thinking about synonyms that are related to the terminology you're looking at. I must add here that if you do have access to a librarian, they do come in handy because they have done this a lot of times. So usually I think their brain is faster in identifying synonyms and identifying other things that we might not have thought about. So if you do have access to one, please ask them to help. I think that's also part of their job, and I found it quite useful for that. So documentation, these are our terms. I just wanted to put this here so that people can see how then we had this is a table from the publication, but this also really helped us as we went along, because sometimes you go along the way and then you find yourself deviating off to a tangent, and referring back to your descriptions and what you're focusing on is very helpful. So for documentation, that's very clear. The thing I wanted to mention just a little bit is about nursing care, because that's quite a broad topic. So we had to settle on something within nursing care. And you can see that there's something called the nursing process, which is a 5-step process that guides nursing care. So out of that nursing process, we were focusing on one aspect of it, which is assessment, where you take several measurements of a patient who is admitted, and then you record them somewhere. And these measurements can be taken multiple times. So you see, because of this definition, then it informs our search terms, so that you have monitoring, assessment, numerical data, vital signs, input, output. But if we had not defined our description and our concept properly, then maybe our search terms would have been slightly different. So that it's important to note the relationship there. The other two terms are inpatient and quality improvement. I ended up adding quality improvement there because studies that are improving something, in this case, documentation, which is the larger body of work that this work lies, means that the study or the paper that we are looking for is likely to be called something related to quality improvement. So that's how this term ended up there. And this term also, you can see the combinations that are there. And yeah, this was quite helpful because I couldn't catch some articles if I didn't have this here. And when I added it, they started showing up. So that was quite helpful for us. So in the end, you can see the complete search strategy, the way you end up combining it. This was what we had for PubMed. So what you would do is just do your first strategy, search. Let's go to the next slide. You run the search, and then from there you check the results to see whether you're finding relevant articles in there. If your results are far off, then that means you need to go back and refine your search. And then once you're confident that this one search strategy is running well in one database, we started with PubMed because it was the most I was most confident in that one. Then you can format the search for other databases. Again, I had help from a librarian. I think I would have taken ages to reformat for all other databases if I didn't have help. So I'm really grateful for that help that I got. But if not, then it's a bit of a learning curve to figure out how to reformat the search for other databases, especially something like CINAHL. It's slightly different from PubMed, but the idea is really the same. So you run your search, you retrieve all your articles. I was able to retrieve quite a number of my articles, but for some I was stuck, and the librarian really helped again. We removed duplicates using EndNote and Microsoft Excel. I found that using EndNote alone didn't quite work for me. So I found a way, Google is your friend. I found a way online to run the duplication using Microsoft Excel. Of course, you keep referring to your protocol just to make sure you're still in the same, you're still following the roadmap that you had. And if you need to change anything, then you can also change it in your protocol. And then for this, it was quite useful to have more than one reviewer working together. And then the third reviewer was a tiebreaker in case we got stuck. So what we did with two reviewers, I and Chris, we screened all the titles and abstracts, and everybody had their own separate lists. And then we had several meetings to discuss and sift through the papers and agree on an initial list of papers that we were going to read through. So all this will end up in your study flow diagram, which I think we're all aware usually ends up in our publication if you're going to publish this work. So next thing was to do the charting. Here, charting is also called data extraction in some fields, or I think in a systematic review, you might find it's called data extraction. So I'm just calling it this because these are the terms that were used in the scoping methodology that we were following. So you develop the extraction and charting tool together with your reviewers. You might have several meetings to do this, and then I used Excel for this. I I charted all the papers, and then the rest was split between the other two reviewers because I was the primary anyway. So we ended up with all papers being read twice. This was quite useful because there's some things I didn't catch, the others caught, and the others, some things they saw and I hadn't seen. At this point also, we ended up removing some papers for various reasons, and you document those reasons as you go along. So next is an example of um, the Excel sheet that we really had about all the papers that we were planning to read. So you can see, like this list here, these 4 articles, we had this on our list of papers to read. And then after we started reading, I discovered like number 1 and 2, the 2 bottom rows were not relevant. And then we had to discuss with other reviewers and put in the reasons there just to make sure that we are going through a rigorous process. And if we are to come back to this, I can track what had been doing all along. So all this ties together to our studies selection flow chart. We started with 2,933 papers that after duplicates were removed, and you can see the process as we ended up removing and sifting through the articles to remain with 12 studies. So what was very helpful, like I said, having someone else to extract the data with you. I mean, actually running the whole process with you, even if you're the one who's the primary person doing the review, having someone else along there with was very useful, because sometimes you think of some things and they're not very clear to you, and the other person is able. And then for us, it was useful because we were a multidisciplinary team. My background is primarily in computer science, and the other team members had my experience in the medical field is mostly experience based out of research, and then the rest were very useful in helping to understand some of the concepts and some of the things that were being presented in the papers. And then again, yeah, just keep clear reasons for your exclusions and inclusions, because you will need that information, especially when you get to the review section. Then lastly was the collation, summarizing, and reporting section stage, as highlighted in the methodology. So referring to the main research question, and I forgot to mention, under the main research question, we had a set of, I think there were 5 questions that we were using to extract data. So using that, you now write your results and discussion section. So what we found that was there was no suitable method for us to adapt for our chart design process. So in the publication, we propose that a human-centered design be used as a method to overcome some of the challenges that were identified. And there were quite a lot of things also we found in the papers that are important to take forward, some of them including involving stakeholders at all stages and identifying champion when you're going forward to implementation. These are some of the things we'll be taking forward to the implementation. And then one of the other things also we found is that there was no clear-cut way of reporting these types of studies. So that was one of our other recommendations. If there's a way to clearly describe implementation studies so that people can follow. We had quite a number of questions hanging from some of the papers. And then the last thing, well, you've done all the work, you want to tell the world about it. Most likely for us, we do it through publications. If you can select your journal early on, I think that would be helpful, because then it helps you keep your focus and see what that journal requires. If they have already published scoping reviews, if they do accept them, look for articles, scoping reviews are published in those journals, and read through, understand how they've been presented, and then format your work in that way. There's no need to reinvent the wheel when a very good example already exists. So if you can identify those journals early on, I think that really helped for me to shorten the process of writing and reformatting, so that I didn't have to do too much work in the end. That's it for me. I think we'll catch up later in the presentation. Thank you. Katherine?
Great, thank you, Naomi. So the next section, we're going to talk a bit about stakeholder engagement, which is a bit more of a unique aspect to the scoping study methodology. There we go. So in the kind of main methodological paper, stakeholder engagement was initially considered an optional extra, but that it brought added value and an additional dimension to the review. Stakeholders can suggest additional references for the study or gray literature. They could provide relevant insights into the subject matter, particularly ones that might not be evoked in the literature. Further publications on the methodology found that it was actually an essential component, and kind of the general steps, which I'll then highlight with an example, are having a clear purpose for engaging with stakeholders, determining the type of stakeholders, the data collection, analysis, reporting, and integration into the study outcomes. Initial finding from the literature can inform the stakeholder consultations, and it can also provide an opportunity for knowledge transfer. I think a couple considerations that, from my own experience, the scoping study where we had a stakeholder component was, depending on the degree of engagement, you might need to consider obtaining ethical approval or ethical exemption. Sometimes you might end up being connected with stakeholders that are not that insightful for your study, and that is okay. Sometimes it's also helpful to know what is not going to be relevant and useful. It's important to consider the timing of this engaging with stakeholders. It could be, you could use them at the more beginning phase where you're still conceptualizing your idea, or later on, kind of while you're drafting the manuscript to look at, to review your findings. If you do consult with stakeholders early in the process, consider engaging them in another discussion or presentation of your findings. So I was part of a scoping study over the last year or a little bit earlier that we had a large stakeholder component. And so we identified possible relevant stakeholders through our organization and through our network, and also through the donor. And we interviewed kind of what we were calling global level stakeholders from a variety of organizations. This scoping study also had a case study component, and so those were some of the initial people that we spoke with as well, kind of while we were reviewing the literature. The interviews were discussion-based. We were at the early stages of understanding the landscape and kind of on conceptualization. And so we had, you had general questions, but we didn't have a formal survey or questionnaire. We took notes and recorded the interviews, and then we extracted the relevant data using the same data collection template that we were using for the literature. We then combined all of the interview insights with the kind of the data that we extracted from the literature. And then we ended up producing a heat map to show where there was like the evidence and the counterfactuals for the framework that we were developing. Kind of towards the end of the project, we held several presentations and discussions with the previously interviewed stakeholders, as well as some other stakeholders that we thought would have relevant insights, and we presented kind of our findings on the outputs of the study, which for this was a definition of a concept, a framework, and an evidence base. And kind of for the case study component of this, we also had similar conversations with kind of the people who were running the projects that we were highlighting. We use these discussions to kind of test out our definition and framework. Like, did this make sense to anybody else besides us? And then we had an opportunity to kind of modify some things prior to submitting the manuscripts for publication. We had ethics exemption in the US and in the 5 case study countries. So now moving on to Yingxi and Christian.
Thank you, Katherine. So yeah, Yingxi and I, we both have been conducting a scoping review just recently as well. And we were also second reviewer for each other's screening process. And we were asked to share some of our practical experiences and challenges we had along the way. And this will probably add to some things Naomi already mentioned. So we go through some of the points we think are worth sharing from the framework by Oxy and O'Malley. And I start with some pre-planning considerations and research question-related challenges, and also how to identify the right body of literature. And Yingqi will then present some really useful tools for the screening process and how to calculate agreement rates. So next, please. So as we already heard, there are different types of reviews for different purposes, and they come with different key characteristics. And as we just learned, a scoping review is focused on finding an overview of a broad field or concepts and does not analyze data to answer a narrow question, but it provides a broad overview of what has been published in a specific field or topic area of interest. And I think a first recommendation here could be to really take the time to familiarize yourself with the different review types and think carefully about the right synthesis method to the right question. A paper that I found really helpful is this one from Maria Grant and colleagues from the University of Sheffield, because they provide a very good overview of the different types with illustrative examples and description of key characteristics as well as strengths and weaknesses. So I think being familiar with the different types will be very helpful later when you articulate why the scoping review is the best methodology to answer your research question. And for the pre-planning, it might be also worth thinking of your time frame. A scoping review is not necessarily less work than a systematic review, and it can take some time. There is often this misconception that a scoping review is a less in time or importance compared to the systematic review because it doesn't assess a quality. So something else I think is recommendable is to avoid the framing, to frame the rationale in the negative. For example, we only did a scoping review, or we are doing a scoping review because we are not assessing quality, or because we are not doing a meta-analysis, because the scoping review does not need that kind of justification, because it is a method by itself and is not a minor to a systematic review. Next, please. So the research question that matches the scoping review method is often a broad question that looks at answering large, more complex exploratory research question and does not necessarily always fit into the PICO format, as we have heard already. Also, it is to consider that it's not a straightforward process and your research question might change. I think the best advice here is to start with your idea of what you want to look at and phrase a question, and then go through the literature with several searches and through the different databases to see what is actually out there, and then come back to refine and rethink your initial idea. And similarly, your inclusion and exclusion criteria may change over time according to how familiar you get to the body of literature that is out there and the specific one you are searching for. So the inclusion-exclusion criteria will be informed by the review process, and it's possible to develop them post hoc, which is also a specific aspect of scoping reviews. Yeah, I found this very useful graph from McGill University on the right side about the iterative nature of scoping reviews. So let's say you search the literature and you find a review, then you maybe want to specify your question or rethink your idea and search the literature again. If an exact review hasn't been done on your question, great. Next, please, click. Then you can start to explore the literature related to your question idea and ask a broader question, what literature is out there on this topic? From there, you can refine your question and narrow it to the specific topic of your interest and begin writing a protocol. I come back to the protocol in a minute. Your ideas become then clearer during this process, and finally, this will help you also to define the specifics of your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Next, please. Another advice is, of course, use best practices and the guidance that is out there when preparing the review. So for systematic reviews, you might already know Prospero as the platform for registering a protocol. And although Prospero doesn't register scoping reviews, I think it's worth checking whether there is one that is related to your initial idea. However, if you want to publish a protocol for scoping review, you could do that with the OSF, Open Science Framework, which is a platform to pre-register any kind of protocol for knowledge synthesis. But you could also submit the protocol to journals such as the Biomed Central. They consider protocols of any type of research for publication following the standard peer review. And the BMJ Open, they will consider publishing without peer review protocols that have formal ethical approval and funding from a recognized and open access research funding body, but otherwise protocols are peer reviewed at the BMJ Open as well. And I think very useful and helpful for writing up your protocol, but also as a guidance for the entire review, is the Prisma extension for scoping reviews that provides a full checklist of how to report your review. So it is worth, I would say, to use the checklist throughout the entire process. Next, please. So I think one step that is not to underestimate, and the way to find the right body of literature is to find the right body of literature. So even if you identified your research question, you refined inclusion and exclusion criteria, you are aware of the different databases where you are looking for literature, and you developed your search strategy accordingly, your outcome might be 20 results, but only 4 papers actually match your criteria, which is very little. Or you find almost 8,000 to 10,000 articles, and of those you might get the feeling most of them are not matching either. And I suspect this comes automatically also with the nature of scoping reviews because of the broad angle of looking at the literature and the comprehensive search strategy. So I think my very personal advice on this is, first of all, don't give up. It's really possible to narrow the search down and find the results. You can change the eligibility criteria and they guide the review, and finally can be used to make decisions on the sources to include or not. However, be careful, the rationale for each of the criteria should be clearly explained. Next, please. So as you know, different databases require different search strategies. So I think I would say the best way to start is with one database first and see how it goes and develop the search strategy accordingly for the others. I usually take Web of Science first because I think it's the easiest in terms of term searches in comparison to PubMed. But as you can see from my PubMed search here, I got almost 8,000 results. But when reviewing my eligibility criteria, which was very comprehensive in the beginning, and when I started screening the search results, I realized that, for example, the term electronic health record is actually not useful and broadening too much, and also not really my focus, as I wanted to look at specific information visualizations. And so by changing these terms slightly, I could narrow down to 1,500, and also by changing the time frame. Again, the scoping review comes with an iterative process, and therefore it is probably good to keep track of any modifications along the way, because it helps you and others to go back later and understand the process. And the final search strategy will be part of the publication or thesis and an appendix anyway. So yeah, other sources also worth scanning are the references to find additional sources, and also create literature if it's applicable to your objectives. But you might find actually really useful information and published reports from, for example, NGOs or institutional or governmental websites that you want to include in your scoping review. Next. So last but not least, I want to repeat what Naomi already mentioned. If you can find a librarian, they're highly competent and skilled people who know any kind of tricks and ways how to refine your search strategy. And yeah, universities usually provide the service through the libraries, so in Oxford through the Bodleian, but there are also specialized librarians at each institute. So for example, for the Medical Science Division and Department of Biology. And I hand over to Yingqi now, who will talk a little bit more about how to process your search results and screen the literature.
Right, thanks, Christiana. Oops. So I will introduce about more like practical tool for doing a scope review, which can also be used for actually many systematic review. So I will start with like identifying research like studies and through database as well as deduplication in EndNote. And then more I'll focus on like study selection using abstract array and also Covenant. Next slide, please. So the recommendation is we use EndNote for deduplication, and we will start with downloading individual like RII files from each of the database. And the recommendation is also we shouldn't use the default duplicate one in Ovid, but instead we should do them separately in each of the databases, including Ovid Embase, Ovid Medline, Global Health, CNL, Cochrane, or if you're using PubMed. And you should then import all your RIS file into EndNote, and there's tons of YouTube videos that tell you how to do so. Usually you just click through library and then find duplicates and then like delete them together. And also one thing from Naomi is that sometimes there will be duplicated paper that show up later. It also occurred to me, but usually I don't think it's a huge problem. You can also delay them during your full text review, your abstract review when you find them. And if you're thinking about using an like tool like Abstractr or Rayon or anything else, what I recommend is usually you can export or your deduplicated reference into an output style needed. For Abstractr, it is usually RIS export. Next slide, please. So people have been thinking about how to do systematic review and scope review through online software or online platforms. And here are several that I am aware of. My experience is mostly with the first one, Abstractr, which is developed by Brown University. It's just a like web-based platform, which is a web link. You need to have internet access to access this platform. And it's only used currently for titles in abstract to be reviewed. And they can also organize the citation by acceptance status in the end. So you can just select the one those of the review or yourself have accepted, and also allow teamwork and also allow single screening, which is like each title and abstract being screened once or being screened twice, which is called a double screen. And the second one, which is Rayon, which I don't have much experience, but I think Katherine had experience and will introduce later. I know one thing good about it. It is like it has a mobile app, so if you want to screen it offline when you are on a bus or on a train, you can also do that, which Abstractr doesn't allow right now. There are also some other tool like the team at Abstractr have developed the SRDR, which is for data extraction. I haven't used it ever, but if people are interested, they can take a look at how to use those platforms. And the last one that I am well aware of is Covenant, which is a great tool for systematic review. It allows both title and abstract as well as full text, which you can transfer PDF from any reference manager. And they also have a built-in data extraction system, which the only bad thing about it is quite expensive. If you're screening it for a single project, it's around $240 US. Some universities have institution like license, but not University of Oxford. Next slide, please. So just using abstract an example of why it is good or it is useful, especially when you have a large sum of literature to screen in a title and abstract. So what they can do is you have a page showing like those, and you have the title, the authors, the abstract, as well as the keyword. And you can use a function called terms to determine what are the terms you're looking for. Like for my review, I'm looking for questionnaire or tools. And if they're using in house officers, interns, residents, those are good terms. And some of the bad terms are doctors, medical doctors, etc. So what they can do is they can highlight those terms, and the ones you want can be highlighted in blue, and the ones you don't want can be highlighted in red. So it can provide a better visualization for you to look for the terms. And also they have a interface here, which you can click relevant, maybe, or irrelevant. However, I personally don't recommend irrelevant because it will somehow mess up with your agreement rate. So usually I recommend people to go with either relevant or irrelevant. Next slide. And if you're leading and reviewing the abstract, it is also super easy. What you can do is just go through the webpage, and there's a help link that explains everything in specific detail. You can set up it pretty much easily. The other people I know of really did it quite easily. And it has this interface of project name, project description, and upload file, which they can tell you what usually you can import. And the one I recommend is RIS files. And screening mode, which is either single screen or double screen, as I mentioned, each paper screened by one reviewer or by two reviewers. They can also have all the abstract by mode, which usually is like most likely to be relevant or random. So the one I recommend is random, especially if your second reviewer is not reviewing all. If both of you are reviewing all the papers, then you can choose most likely to be relevant because they have a machine learning technique that can follow the pattern of what is accepted and what is not accepted. I haven't used it much because my second reviewer usually is not reviewing all of the paper. And also there's a pilot round, which is extremely useful if you are using, like you haven't agreed on all your inclusion or exclusion criteria, or you want to test out whether those are clear to people. So you can do a pilot round where you can both screen like 20 papers and come back together and review what's your accepted and excluded like criteria. So you can finalize it and erase all your rating for the pilot round. But everything will be very like self-explanatory on the help page when you are setting up a review in Abstract Hub. Next slide. Yeah, back to you, Katherine.
Thanks, Yingxi. So another tool that Yingxi mentioned is Rayan, which is a web-based application from the Qatari Computing Research Institute. It is free. And while its functionality is not as good as Covidence, I've just started to use it and I found that it's quite easy to use. You can upload citations, detect duplications, and I found that it was actually maybe more sensitive than EndNote to duplications because there were ones that EndNote didn't pick up. And they will also tell you like how the percentage of how close the abstracts are to each other to give guidance on if it's actually a duplicate or not. You can screen title an abstract by multiple reviewers, upload PDF for full text screen, which can also be done by multiple reviewers. One limitation is that unlike in Covidence, it's not possible to move from the abstracts or the citations that you've selected in the title and abstract screening directly to a full text screen within the same review that like you've created on the platform. But I haven't done this yet, but what I found out is that if you download the citations from the selected, kind of from your selected screen titles and abstracts back into EndNote, you can then create a new review and upload that shorter citation list and then do full text screen back in Rayan, just in a new review. So that's what I'm planning to do, but I haven't gotten to that stage yet. I also don't think that it kind of self-generates a randomization for a second reviewer, which I haven't gotten there yet, but from what I can tell, it might not be able to do that like you can do in Abstractor. And as she said, you can, there's a mobile app, and so it can be used offline and then later synced. Okay, back to you, Yingxi.
Right, and just to add, like for Abstract, they only allow title and abstract and no full text review. So what I did for Abstract, the full text stage, usually I just did it in Excel sheet. And also because I usually did the full text stage along with data extraction, so Excel sheet make perfect sense. So the next thing I'm introducing is more on inter-agreement reliability or inter-agreement rate for two or more reviewers. So usually you can see in some of the systematic review papers, they report inter-rater agreement rate, which is a step for quality assurance to make sure that your agreement rate is good and your scoping review or systematic review is good enough. Ideally, it should be done in all three stages, including title and abstract, full text, as well as data extraction. And usually some people don't, like most of the people I've seen haven't reported yet, but I think one justification, especially if your second reviewer is not reviewing all the papers, it is really a good choice. In my case, my title and abstract usually have like 10,000 papers, which I can handle, but it is not usually like easy to find a second reviewer to review all the papers in a short notice. So the recommendation is if your second reviewer only review a certain percentage of them, and if your inter-rater agreement rate is high enough, it means that what people have agreed on, like based on your exclusion criteria, is good enough. So you can move directly after your 40% or 30% into the full text review. So what I had in my text is like author A reviewed all the abstract and title and abstract to assess validity for full text review, and the random subset of 40% were reviewed by B. The agreement rate on which study to include between A and B for this subset was high, therefore we proceed with the full text review. Next slide. So inter-rater agreement rate isn't a new thing. People have been using it in many other fields as well, in diagnostics and many other like applications. And there are different examples and thresholds for interpreting the level of integrated reliability. And this is just one of the examples. When the inter-rater reliability is high, usually around 0.8 to 1, it is an excellent agreement. When it is below 0.2, it is poor agreement rate. And the most common inter-rater agreement rate or reliability is coherence kappa, which is, as I mentioned, also used in many other fields. I'm not a person too familiar with like statistics, but a kappa equals like the PO refers to the observed agreement rate, and PE refers to the agreement rate by chance. Even though coherence is the most commonly used inter-rater agreement rate, it is not usually good. Next slide. So people have been investigating this for a long term. Usually there is like a high agreement rate but low kappa. And the problem or the reason for low kappa is that coherence kappa only perform well when the trait prevalence is close to 0.5, which means that for systematic review or scope review, is if around 50% of the thing you are screening are included or excluded, then it will have a good kappa, or like it will perform well. So if the prevalence is either close to 0 or close to 1, it will reduce kappa significantly, which applies to systematic reviews first, like title abstract stage, quite commonly, which like we have a rare finding. For example, for my review, the first stage, 1,000 papers, there probably will be only 1,000, like 10,000 papers, probably only like 5% will be included in full text review, which is a significantly low prevalence. So people have investigated and come up with a new statistic called a Guet's AC1. I'm also not familiar with how it actually works, but it has been proved by several literature as a better alternative when the prevalence is either close to 0 or close to 1. And also for like categorical like traits as well. Next slide. So just as an example, for my first review, like there's usually just around like 10,000 papers, and 40% of them were reviewed by 2 reviewers, which is 2,900. And as you can see from this 2x2 table, there's around 180 papers who are rated by as include by either of the reviewer, and around like 2,700 review considered as like exclude by both of us. So the percentage agreement rate is really high. It is around 96%. But coherence kappa only was 50%, which isn't good. But Guet's AC1 is 96% as well, which refers to when the prevalence is quite low, it's only 6%. You should report Guet's AC1 as a better alternative for inter-rater agreement rate. So the recommended way to report it is we shouldn't only report what is good, but neglect what is bad. So I report all the 3 like inter-rater agreement rate, percentage agreement, coherence kappa, and Guet's AC1. I explain why we use Guet's AC1 as a better threshold. And then we proceed with the full text review. I think that's all I have. Back to Katherine and Claire.
Great, thanks everyone. So we have 2 slides which list out several useful resources and tools that we've either referred to or that we've used and found have been helpful. So we will, when we circulate the slides, you'll be able to, you'll have all of this list. So great. Now we can open it up for some questions, comments.